everyone. I hope you are doing well. This is the first of our lectures today about coastal habitats. We'll have 3 lectures on coastal habitats. I hope you're all hanging in there. I want to encourage you to, if you have your books, I know some of you may have trouble because you're not actually at school, but if you have your books, keep up with this chapter. There's a chapter on coastal habitats. Make sure that you're answering the questions after these lectures, and let me know if you have any questions. So let's go ahead and get started. The first coastal habitat we're going to be talking about today are estuaries, and there are several types of estuaries. The thing that sort of joins these and unifies them is the idea that they're semi-enclosed, they're connected to the ocean via some sort of inlet, and estuaries are a place where fresh and salt water mix. So they have some sort of freshwater source like a river, and then of course ocean water comes in through the inlet. Okay, so there are several types of estuaries that we're going to be talking about today. One would be a river valley, and these are typically a delta or a drowned river valley, and we can see here that this is where the river is coming in, and then there's some sort of inlet from the ocean. And what we typically see in profile, so this is, if we were to look at this in profile from here to here, what we typically see is a shallow shelf where the river is, because that river is carrying a lot of sediments out with it, right? It's carrying river sediments from upstream out to the ocean. Those are being deposited, and as they're being deposited, this delta, this sort of plateau here, it will grow out from land into the ocean. We see this, a great example of this would be the Mississippi River, okay, down near New Orleans. So typically they have some sort of shelf, and then you get into a deeper estuary where water is mixing, and then the ocean would be over here. Another type is a fjord. So typically in a fjord, what you have are very, very steep sides on either side here, and these were typically created by a glacier, where a glacier would have been here, and it would have actually pushed its way, dug its way through the rock here to carve out this very, very steep and narrow feature. So often they will have what's called a morainal sill. This is all stuff that the glaciers drop. So this is it from the side. The glaciers would have grown from here and pushed all of this gravel and rock down here. This would have been the limit of the glacier here, and this is what they would have dropped, and it's called glacial moraine. Okay, a great example of glacial moraine, although not in a fjord, but a great example of glacial moraine would be Cape Cod or Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, or Long Island. Those are all islands that are made of glacial moraine. So sometimes that glacial moraine stays in the valley here, and you can see it sort of makes a little sill here. So it gets really, really shallow near the entry of it. So it's deeper inside the fjord, and then there's a sill at the end of it, okay? And then from the side, the walls are very, very steep in a fjord. Another type of estuary would be a bar-built estuary. A really good example of this would be the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We've talked about the idea that we have longshore currents that can build sand spits, right? And then typically what happens is you have an estuary that grows behind these, okay? Another great example, actually very, very similar to this, would be what we have here in Georgia, where we have barrier islands that act like this sand spit, okay? And so typically here we have an estuary that is behind a protected sand spit or even a barrier island. And then a final example would be a tectonic estuary. And these happen in places where you have fault lines. This would be a fault line here, and this would be a fault line here, that in some way cause the land that was here to drop down. And when that drops down, water fills it. Now, estuaries tend to be temporary. They often fill with sediment, which fills them up, and then they're no longer an estuary. They can grow outward. For example, with our drowned river valley, they can grow outward. Let me get a better laser pointer here. Estuaries can grow outward. So, for example, here, this delta, this sill here would grow outward. So everything up here would no longer be an estuary. It would be part of the river, and everything out here would no longer be ocean. It would be part of the estuary, right? So that's something that can happen. Or you can have sea level rising or falling. Remember, sea level is not a constant thing. Depending on our climate, either we have a lot of the world's water that get tied up at the poles in glaciers, or those glaciers melt, and we have very, very high sea level, okay? So estuaries are temporary because of these factors. I'm going to talk just briefly about a couple of these, and then we'll get more in depth into some of the other ones. And one of the ones I'm just going to talk briefly about is a fjord. This word is a Norwegian word. It's one of the few Norwegian words that have been adopted into other languages. So fjord, and you can see one here. They tend to be long, long valleys with very, very sharp edges, very steep edges, right? So some examples of where you would find these. Well, Norway is just full of these. So this is the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea out here, okay? And this is Norway. And all of this coastline here, these are just completely full of fjords. It's actually very, very beautiful. There's a lot of tourism there because, so you can see this is a cruise ship here. A lot of tourism because it's just spectacular landscape. Another place that we have fjords, here in the United States, we have fjords in Alaska. So this is Kenai Fjords National Park. And it's very cold there, so for a long time these fjords have been filled with glaciers. If you've seen footage of glaciers from cruise ships in Alaska, this is where they're visiting them. A lot of cruise ships will come up here and visit these glaciers. Okay, so this fjord had a glacier that was pushed down. It pushed its way down here. There's a sill down in here where it dropped all of its glacial till, and it has retreated. And a lot of these glaciers are retreating very rapidly because of climate change. But this is a place in the United States where we can go and see fjords of our own. Another one of these estuaries that I'm not going to spend too much time on is a tectonic estuary. And a great example of that right here in the United States is San Francisco Bay. So this is the bay here. This is San Francisco Bay, okay? And we have these red lines. Do you see these red lines here? So these red lines are tectonic faults, where tectonic plates are working with one another and working against one another. And that's exactly what happened here. The land that was here dropped out, and ocean water rushed in, and it created San Francisco Bay. So this is a great example of a tectonic estuary. So now we're going to get a little bit more in depth into what happens in the estuaries, and we're going to talk a little bit more about more common types of estuaries. So one of the important things to think about when we consider estuaries is how do fresh and salt water mix in those estuaries, okay? So a general idea of how salt water and fresh water mixes, we have a river up here. This is the source of our fresh water. And we have the ocean down here. This is the source of our salt water. And then in between, we have different levels of salinity, where we have slightly salty water, brackish water, or very salty water. All right, and we can have all this stuff in here. We can have this mixing occur in a few different ways. We can have something called a salt wedge estuary. We can have a partially mixed estuary, or we can have a well mixed estuary. We're going to look at each one of these types of mixings in depth. So this is what we consider a salt wedge estuary. And in a salt wedge estuary, we have a large river input, so lots of fresh water coming in. We have a small tidal input. So there's really more influence from the river than there is from the ocean. Okay, so what we typically find here is we have salt water. Remember, we've spent some time on what happens when different types of waters mix, and salt water is more dense than fresh water, so it stays on the bottom. So we have a layer of salt water on the bottom, and then we have on the top a layer of fresh water. And one of the interesting things that we find in these estuaries is we find in between these layers of water, we find breaking internal waves where you have so much freshwater flow and a little bit of upstream flow that it causes turbulence in here. And these waves actually look like waves on the surface. And sometimes you even see that you have breakers in them. Okay. So this is an interesting sort of thing that happens in salt wedge estuaries. If we were to look at an estuary from the side and look at the parts per thousand, remember this symbol here is parts per thousand, and we were to look at the haloclines that occur here, up near the river, we would have around 0% salinity. And then down at the ocean, we'd have around 35% salinity, because that's the average salinity of the oceans, right? And then what we would see is that this 0%, see how it's sort of leaning out a little bit? It's causing a little bit of a wedge. There'd be a little bit of mixing, and then we'd have this 10%, or 10 parts per thousand. Sorry, it's not percent, it's per thousand. So you can see it's leaning out, and then we have this great big wedge here, right? So this is what we call this a salt wedge, because the wedge goes underneath and sort of sticks down there underneath and doesn't mix particularly well with this stuff on top. So that's a salt wedge estuary. Now another example would be a partially mixed estuary. This is where we have a good amount of tidal input, so large tidal input, less river input, okay, so a smaller river input, and we actually have a lot of mixing between the two. Instead of having those two distinct layers, like here we have two distinct layers that don't mix very much. Here we have, if you look from the top to the bottom, fresh, and then we have this brackish layer that is sort of half fresh and half salty, and then saltier, right? So we have some mixing that occurs here. All right, let's see. We tend to have this mixing because tide causes turbulence and mixing. As it comes in and goes out and comes in and goes out, it's sort of like taking a spatula and mixing up the brownie mix, right? We tend to have a relatively weak halocline. So rather than having really distinct layers where we have fresh on top of salt, you can see that we have kind of this gently blended, where it goes from very salty to kind of brackish to also brackish but more fresh, fresher, freshest, right? One of the interesting things about partially mixed estuaries is that we actually see sediment being carried into the estuary from offshore. So you'll end up with sediment coming in from the river, right, because it's carrying things from upstream. But then because we have a strong tidal input, we actually have sediment coming from the ocean and being deposited into the estuary. So the estuary gets sediment from both ends, from the river and from the tides. A great example of a partially mixed estuary is the Chesapeake Bay. And we're going to actually spend some time looking at the Chesapeake Bay in just a few moments because it's such an important part of the United States. Now, a well-mixed estuary is really very interesting. A well-mixed estuary tends to be very, very big, all right, very, very wide. And because of that, we actually have the Coriolis effect, causing salt water to end up on one side of the river or the estuary, and fresh water to end up on the other side of the estuary. So we actually, rather than it being sort of an up and down difference, it tends to be side to side, where we have ocean water on one side and we have river water on the other because of that Coriolis effect taking place. So these are the ways that estuaries can mix, where we can have fresh and salt water mixing. We can either have a salt wedge where we don't have a lot of mixing, where you tend to have a wedge of salt that stays under that layer of fresh water, or we can have a partially mixed estuary where we end up with a lot of brackish water in the middle. And sometimes we have this very well mixed estuary where we have lots of mixing taking place, and it's actually so broad that one side of it is saltier than the other. So let's talk about the biology of estuaries. So two key concepts about the biology of estuaries is that estuaries tend to have low diversity, but they tend to have high productivity. Okay, so not a lot of species can live there, but the species that do live there in very, very high numbers. There's a lot of biomass, there's a lot of primary productivity, so a very, very rich food chain. So if we look at this figure here, so this is the number of species on the y-axis, and you notice that there's not any numbers because this is just sort of a conceptual model that they are presenting to us here. And then here we have, this is parts per thousand salinity, okay, where we have fresh water down here. We have, it says stenohaline marine. This basically means it's like ocean here. And then in here, eurohaline, this means it's relatively salty. And then in here, this is what we would consider brackish, okay? So we can see there's three lines here. We have freshwater species, and those are very, very common at the river mouth. But that number, the diversity of freshwater species falls off precipitously as we just get a little bit of salinity. See that? 5% salinity. Freshwater species really can't, they can't tolerate that. We've talked about osmoregulation. So when you are a species that is evolved to live in fresh water, you don't have the mechanisms to get rid of the salt, okay? You don't have the mechanisms to keep water in your body and get salt out of it, okay? So these guys, they're not adapted to living with any sort of salt around them. Now you can see we have, these are marine species. They're very, very common where it's salty, but we have the same issue. As things start to get fresher, they're not evolved to osmoregulate when water is around them is fresh, okay? When water around them is fresh, it wants to get into their body. And so they're not designed to be able to handle that. Remember, freshwater species tend to urinate a lot, and saltwater species don't. So these guys have no way to, their kidneys are not designed to get rid of all the water that comes into their bodies. So they can't live in these lower salinity environments. If they get in here, they die. So they're limited to saltier areas. So these marine species, these tend to drop off pretty quickly as well when we get into these thresholds of around 15 or 20 parts per thousand. And then you have these species here, this small number. See how small this number is compared to, look, there's a lot of freshwater species, there's a lot of marine species, but over here, look, it's really, really a small number of species that are designed to live in brackish water. And they need to be able to handle all sorts of changes to their environment, where you might have fresh water coming in sometimes when there's floods, or when there's droughts, you might have a lot of salt water. So these are evolved and adapted to live under these conditions where we have changes in salinity, and they can live anywhere from 0 to around 15 parts per thousand of salinity. So diversity is very low compared to the diversity of freshwater species and the diversity of marine species. Now we can look at our productivity though, and we can compare the productivity of estuaries to all sorts of other biomes or other types of ecosystems. You can see estuaries are right up at the top. Estuaries, swamps and marshes, and tropical rainforests are the most productive of our ecosystems. That means that their primary productivity is very, very high. They fix a lot of carbon, right? And compare this to all of these other ecosystems that have lower productivity. So this is the average net primary productivity, right? So you can see that estuaries are way up here in terms of kilocalories that are fixed per meter squared per year. They're way, way up there compared to all of these other ones. So two key concepts: low diversity, but the species that do live there have very, very high productivity. Let's talk a little bit more about why we have low productivity and why we have high productivity. Okay, so the first thing to realize about estuaries is that we have wildly fluctuating conditions, sometimes really fresh, sometimes really salty. We have species that, if you can adapt to those to those conditions, then you can outcompete other species, right? So the ones that can outcompete really do it well. They outcompete everybody else. We have an abundance of nutrients because we have river water coming down. We might have water mixing in from the ocean. So we have a lot of nutrients, but we tend to have very irregular plankton blooms, right? So that means that you need to be a species that can really take advantage of those blooms when they occur if you're going to live there. And you need to be able to survive when those blooms don't happen. Another reason that we have low diversity is that the fauna on the bottom, the benthic fauna, they need to be able to survive the substrate, which tends to be really muddy, tends to be soft, right? So you can't have things settle that need to glue themselves down. So that limits some of the things that can live there. In terms of fish that live there, most of the fish that live in estuaries tend to be juvenile. There's not a lot of fish that live there permanently. Okay, but there are actually quite a lot of fish who will come into the estuary, lay their eggs. Their babies will stay there because there's high productivity. So that's great for them, and because it's well protected, there's not they're protected from storms, they're protected from big predators, right? So there's actually a lot of fish who will lay their eggs or give birth to their babies in estuaries, but then they will leave, and when the babies mature, they will also leave. Let's talk more about high productivity. So we have very high productivity in estuaries because nutrients are abundant. So one of the keys to salt marshes is that when plants die, we don't have decomposers that break them down particularly well. So we had a lot of what we call detritus, and that's just like dead plant stuff. So that tends to form the bottom of a very rich food chain in salt marshes. The bacterial decomposers that are in these salt marshes actually are a very rich food source. So things eat not just the plants, but they'll eat the bacteria that are breaking down the plants. Now, one thing to note is that we have very high primary productivity, but it can be intermittent. It can depend on conditions. It can depend on seasons, things like that. So even though we do have high productivity, it's not necessarily year-round. It's not necessarily year after year after year after year. Let's take a look at this food web that we have in estuaries. And it's kind of interesting because if you notice the bottom of it, we have at the bottom something called particle producers. And particles are sort of just little things that are getting eaten, okay? And they don't have to be living things. They could be dead things. So before we even get to this particle producers, we have down here plants. Some of those plants feed directly into producing particles. The marsh and mudflat plants are producing this detritus that we were just talking about. It's just like dead pieces of plant, okay? And then some of them are feeding indirectly, where we have plants that are upstream in the river, and they're producing, when they die, they're being broken down by decomposers, and that dissolved organic material is getting fed into the estuary. It's being carried down from the river into the estuary. So in the particle producers, we have detritus that's coming from the marsh and mudflat plants. We have bacteria that are feeding on the detritus, but they actually can be eaten by other things. And then we have phytoplankton cells that are they're being fed by these, or they're feeding into these, right? So we have all these things that can be eaten in the estuary. And then we have particle consumers. These are organisms that will eat either living things, or they'll just eat detritus directly, or dead cells directly. Things like we have the mussels, we have the oysters, we have worms. We've looked at worms before. We have zooplankton. And then we get up into this higher level of our food web where we have predators like birds and fish and crabs. So it's kind of an interesting food chain because the bottom of it is all about particles and not necessarily about organisms. We're going to look at an example here of an estuary, and this is an important part of the east coast of the United States and an important part of our history in the United States because many of our first settlers settled in this area. So we're going to be looking at the Chesapeake Bay. And the Chesapeake Bay is in Virginia and Maryland and Delaware. So 3 states directly have part of the Chesapeake Bay in them, but the watershed that feeds into the Chesapeake Bay goes all the way up into Pennsylvania. It's actually gigantic. It's a huge watershed. This drains a lot of the East Coast. Now, this was a drowned river valley, okay? And we can look at the history of the Chesapeake Bay, and 500,000 years ago, this all was land. So this is, the white is the current Chesapeake Bay. The yellow is the current shoreline. And this blue is where it was 500,000 years ago. And you can see it was just a little river then. So 500,000 years ago, where we now have water, this was land. 150,000 years ago, we see some slight changes. We see that the river has actually moved a little bit to the south, and rivers move, so that's not surprising. And then about 18,000 years ago, this is where we see that the river valley moved south to the mouth of the current Chesapeake Bay. And you can see that this river kind of mirrors what we see in the Chesapeake Bay now. So when our glaciers started to melt because our climate was warming and we had sea level rising, the sea level rose and filled this valley here. So this would have been a river valley. And it filled this up, and this is what we see now. So this is the current Chesapeake Bay. So this is an enormous part of our eastern coast. And so let's see. We have here, this is New Jersey here, and we have the Delmarva Peninsula. It's called that because it's the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia peninsula, because they all have parts of this peninsula. Okay, so this is land here. We can see the bay here. Okay, and then we can see out here we have land. This is Washington, D.C. This is Richmond, Virginia. Okay, and you can see all of these rivers that are feeding into it. We have the James River. The James River runs way up into the Appalachians. Okay, we have the Rappahannock. We have the Potomac that comes all the way up here. Sorry, this is the Rappahannock. This is the Potomac here. And then we have the Susquehanna. The Susquehanna goes way, way, way up into, this is Pennsylvania. So it goes way up into Pennsylvania. And so this drains a huge amount of the East Coast. And let's look at the salinity of this. We have, this is the Atlantic Ocean. So this zone of the Chesapeake Bay is considered polyhaline. It's very, very salty. Okay, and then we have this green section here. This is moderately salty, called meso. The word meso means middle. Okay, so this is moderately salty, anything in green here. And then we have anything in blue is oligohaline. Okay, so a little bit of salt, and you can see it goes, we have a little bit of salt water. Wow, this is like a long ways from the mouth. This is over 100 miles. We have a little bit of salt water coming all the way up here. All right, and then we have this whole section in white. So for example, here, the James River, the tide actually, there's no salt in it, but because we have tides that sort of block the river's water from coming out, we actually have tides in here, even though it's fresh. And if you drive along I-95, it goes straight through Richmond, and you'll see great big ocean-going vessels all the way up in Richmond because they're able to follow the James River. So let's look at what the surface salinity is. Remember, the salinity on the surface is not necessarily what we see on the bottom, right? Because we have different types of mixing. So out here, this is the polyhaline area where it is, you can see that the salinity is in the 20s. And then we have declining salinity until we get up into the red would be freshwater, okay? One of the important things to know about the Chesapeake Bay is that we have flow going in different directions on the bottom and the top. Because this is a partially mixed estuary, we have mixing that occurs because of the tide, and then we have the influence of rivers. So we have a strong upstream flow on the bottom where that denser salt water is flowing upstream. And then we have a strong downstream flow on the surface. So we actually have flow going in different directions in the Chesapeake Bay. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at what lives in the Chesapeake Bay. And this is sort of our conceptual model of what lives here. One of the really important parts of the Chesapeake Bay is seagrass, underwater grasses. And here's a seagrass meadow. This is someone who is researching. When we research these, we actually throw these. These are called quadrats. We throw them down and we look at percent cover within this square to ask how much of this is covered in seagrass. And she or he would put this down many, many times all around here and then take the average of this. And we can look over time. We can ask how much of the bottom is covered with, this is called SAV, okay? And it's submerged aquatic vegetation. So if we look at the number of acres, this is thousands of acres. Right now we have around 90,000 acres of SAV, of submerged aquatic vegetation. We can see that has fluctuated quite a bit, and we actually can see a sort of an upward trend, which is great. We'll talk a little bit about the Chesapeake Bay, but back here in the 80s, the Chesapeake Bay was not in great shape environmentally because we had a lot of problems in the Chesapeake Bay. We'll talk about them in a moment here. But you can see sort of a general upward trend, which is exactly what we want to see. A healthy Chesapeake Bay is just full of submerged aquatic vegetation. Also on the bottom of our food chain, we have all of our old friends here. We have our phytoplankton, so the cyanobacteria, diatoms, dinoflagellates, other types of green algae, and coccolithophores. So we have all these guys at the bottom of the food chain, in addition to our other producers. So these are the primary producers. We have the phytoplankton and we have the SAVs. We also have our zooplankton, and these are sort of the typical things that we see in ocean ecosystems. A really important part of the Chesapeake Bay would be oyster reefs. This is a reef here in the Chesapeake Bay, and you can see how gigantic it is, right? You can see that these are sort of building up. So these reefs will build themselves up because baby oysters will settle on top of adult oysters, right? So oysters are an incredibly important part of the Chesapeake Bay. And this is true historically and in modern times. So this is a shell mound. This is what's called a midden, M-I-D-D-E-N, of Native Americans. So we know that humans have been using oysters in the Chesapeake Bay for thousands upon thousands of years. And some of these middens are very tall. They're basically garbage dumps where Native Americans would come and eat oysters in huge quantities. It was an important part of their diet. And then they would throw them into this giant pile. And these piles are like much taller than you are. They're huge. So these are old dumps of Native Americans. And you can see there's a shovel here. Archaeologists have been doing work in here because not only would they throw their shells in here, but they would put all sorts of other artifacts in here as well. So these have been historically harvested for thousands of years. This is a more recent history. So this would have been in maybe the early 1900s or the late 1800s. And you can see that that in those days, they would have used great big rakes. They had basically these huge long rakes with long handles. You can see he's got one in each hand. And he's grabbing them from the bottom and then harvesting them and filling this part of the sailboat up, all right? However, we've gotten so good at harvesting oysters that unfortunately, oyster populations have really precipitously dropped off. And you can see this is a graph from 1939 to relatively recent, 2012. And this is the number of oysters that were landed. In other words, the number of oysters that were caught just in Maryland. So this is just part of, just one of the states that is part of the Chesapeake Bay. And you can see back in the 1930s and 1940s, we had, wow, over 3 million bushels of these. But if we look in modern times, there's sort of a drop off in the 60s here, and then more in the 70s, and then suddenly a really precipitous drop off. And that's because we just don't have enough oysters anymore to really have a strong harvest of them, of wild oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is a real problem for the Chesapeake Bay. So oysters provide a lot of benefits. They build habitat. You can see this reef has built habitat, and there's all sorts of things living on it. They take up nutrients, and they clean the water. So one of the things I want to show you here is what the water looks like when you have oysters and when you don't. So this tank here, they have the same amount of water in them. It's the same water that's just taken from the Chesapeake Bay. This has 20 oysters in it, and this has no oysters in it. And this is a time lapse of 4 hours. So let's take a look at this here. So look at the difference in those. Let's look at this again. I'll talk while this is going on. Turn this off and we'll replay it. So you can really see the difference in water clarity that occurs when you have oysters in the water compared to when you don't, because they're filtering out all of the phytoplankton, all of the zooplankton, all of those particles that we were talking about that are part of the food chain here. So they're really good at cleaning out all that stuff. And that means that when you have clean water, when you have water that doesn't have a bunch of sediment floating up in it, you can have that SAV, you can have that seagrass. So when you have a healthy oyster population, then you have a healthy SAV population as well. All right, so you have improved water quality. You don't have all this sediment resuspension. All right, so this is what happens when you have healthy reefs. Now, what are some of the things that are a challenge for oysters? So one challenge would be predation. I love this. This is a cow-nosed ray that we'll talk about more in upcoming lectures, but they love to eat oysters. And then we have predatory snails, we have sea stars, we have crabs, so predation. But this is sort of mostly a natural part of stress to oysters, except when you make changes and you end up with more of something because you've changed some sort of keystone species or something like that. You can have disease in oysters. You can have salinity that's too high or too low. So oysters really like brackish water, and they have sort of a window of that brackish water that they like. So if it becomes, for example, too fresh because we've had very, very strong rain from a hurricane or something like that, or too salty because we have a drought and ocean water is able to move in more, then they don't do very well. If the temperature goes too high, they don't go well. And if we have low dissolved oxygen, they also don't do well, okay? We also can have silt burying them. So if you have a lot of turbidity, if you have something really stirring up the bottom, you can end up with reefs being buried. So these are some of the challenges to oysters. Oysters are incredibly important to the Chesapeake Bay. When we have healthy oyster reefs, we have a healthy Chesapeake Bay. Now we get up into the higher levels of our food chain, and so we have all these sort of consumers here: shrimp and amphipod, worms. We also have, these are bay anchovies. These are really, really little. These are about the size of my pinky, and they occur in vast, vast quantities, huge biomass. They're an enormous part of the ecosystem. They're filter feeders, and they will filter out all sorts of things. We have alewives here. These are also filter feeders. Okay, and then we have, these are some of my favorite. These are striped bass, and these are so these are all considered bait fish, but this is a game fish that is very, very popular. People love to go out and fish for them, and they're a really important part of the economy there because tourists will come and fish, or people will go out and buy boats and buy all, spend all the money to go out fishing. So they're a really, really important part of the ecosystem there, and part of the economy of Chesapeake Bay. Now, one of the big challenges for the Chesapeake Bay is water quality. And what we can have happen is we can have very high nutrient load occur in the Chesapeake Bay because it drains a lot of agricultural land. And so if those lands are fertilized, it means you get a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus that come down from the river. Okay. So when we have high nutrient load because of draining of agriculture and low river flow in summer, when these two conditions occur, we end up with highly stratified water, which means that we would have layers that don't mix. And we have something called hypoxia or dead zones. Okay, so hypoxia is low oxygen, very low dissolved oxygen, which means you don't have any oxygen for things to breathe there. So you end up with what we call dead zones. If fish get into these dead zones, they die. If crabs get into them, they die. So we can look at basically hypoxia that occurs over time in the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have several years here, right? Blue is the most recent year that they have data for, 2019, okay? And you can see the daily hypoxic volume. And this is basically just saying how much of this particular area is hypoxic. And so in May, it's very, very low. In October, it's very, very low. But you can see in summer, we have a lot of hypoxia occurring. So a lot of parts of the bay that are hypoxic. Let's just look at this and let's move on and see what hypoxia and dead zones look like in the Chesapeake Bay. So how do dead zones occur? So first of all, we have this part of our country is very, very well developed with cities, factories. There's a lot of farming. So everything from the land around the Chesapeake Bay runs down into it. Okay, so we have all sorts of running farming, sewage treatment, power plants, all of that, and that gives us an excess nutrient runoff, especially that nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, those are limiting factors for plants, which means when you don't have very much of it, you don't have very much plant growth. But when you have a lot of it, you stimulate algae blooms. And so right down here, this is what an algae bloom looks like in the Chesapeake Bay. You can see it's some sort of red dinoflagellate here. Okay, so we have phytoplankton that is blooming, and you might say, well, that seems like a good thing. There's lots of primary productivity. Primary productivity is only good if it's not in excess, because when you have too much of it, these plants will die, and when they die, they sink to the bottom and they decompose. Decomposers need oxygen, and so they use up all of the oxygen in the area where this phytoplankton sinks. So the phytoplankton dies, it sinks. The bacteria down here uses all the oxygen, and so nothing else in this area has any oxygen to breathe. And this is what we call hypoxia. Okay, so what this looks like, we tend to see a lot of fish kills. So this is a fish kill here, where there's fish that are just dead and floating on the surface. And we also have invertebrates are also subject to it. So this is a dead blue crab, right? And basically anything that needs oxygen is going to suffocate. So in 2005, we had a really bad dead zone. And you can see that this dead zone, red means like it's a really, really bad area. There's very, very little oxygen and lots of fish kills, lots of animals dying. And then 10 means healthy. And then we have this yellow and green in between. So you can see most of the Chesapeake Bay was subject to hypoxia, and especially this red part was really, really severe hypoxia. Right, so this is one of the big challenges for the Chesapeake Bay. Because we have excess nutrients, we end up with these fish kills in the Chesapeake Bay. What we really end up with is two different scenarios in the Chesapeake Bay. We can either have a healthy bay where we have a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation that provides food and shelter for animals, right? That also enriches the water with oxygen. That sustains a lot of the animals, all right? And this supports a healthy commercial fishery for fish, crabs, and oysters. So these things kind of all feed one another. We have high oxygen, we have lots of oysters, we have clear water because we have lots of oysters. We have a lot of SAV because we have clear water. That gives us a lot of animals. This is just like this sort of this system that feeds itself with healthy elements. But if you start to add these things in and you have nutrient runoff, you have sedimentation, you have overfishing, and you have storms, we can tip from this healthy bay to a degraded ecosystem where we have too many nutrients, we have too much phytoplankton, we have dead zones because when that phytoplankton sinks down at the bottom, the decomposers are using all of the oxygen, right? And we get into this cycle where it's hard to get out of having a degraded ecosystem. So the nutrients run off, they feed a massive algae bloom, they decrease water clarity. Remember, water clarity, really important to SAV, right? So they decrease water clarity. As they die, they sink, they get eaten by microbes. We have very, very low oxygen. We don't have healthy fish, crabs, or oysters. Remember, you need the oysters because they make that water clearer, right? So all of this feeds into sort of a very unhealthy feedback. One of the really, really important things to do is to decrease those nutrients. So a lot of the efforts of government and environmental groups around the Chesapeake Bay is to decrease nutrients because that's one of those key things that allows us to have a healthy bay with healthy oysters, healthy SAV, and healthy populations in here. Let's move on to another type of coastal environment, a coastal habitat, and this would be a lagoon. Okay, so here we have an estuary, and in an estuary we have freshwater input. But in lagoons, we do not have freshwater input. We just have saltwater input. And you can see we have a lagoon here that is sort of cut off from the ocean, and we have a lagoon that has tidal inlets into it, all right? So it doesn't seem logical that it would be cut off, right? But this might be a lagoon that is only in connection with the river or with the ocean when the tide is really high or there's a storm and salt water gets pushed in there. But under normal conditions, the salt water is separated by some sort of barrier here. So I have some examples here of some lagoons. So this is a what we call an atoll. And these are very common in the Pacific Ocean. And so this is the ocean out here, and this is the lagoon here. And you can see there's some connections. You have very, very, very shallow connections in some places along here. And then you have all this land that is acting as a barrier. We have, if you've heard of the city of Venice, in Italy, this is Venice, and it is inside of a lagoon. So this map here is of Italy, and this is the Mediterranean Sea, and Venice is right here, and it is inside of a lagoon. So these are barrier islands, right? And there are some inlets, some tidal inlets here, and there is no river feeding into this. So it is a lagoon. And then an example closer to home, we have the Indian River Lagoon. So this is Florida here, and it's right about here. It's near Cape Canaveral. So this is cut off from the ocean, has barrier islands, but there's no river running down into it. So this is considered a lagoon. Lagoons tend to be calm because they are protected by some sort of barrier. They tend to be shallow. And they can be anything from brackish to hypersaline. And hypersaline means that it's very, very salty. So a lot of times what will happen is because it's warm and shallow in the lagoon, you'll have a lot of evaporation. So all the water evaporates, but the salt stays behind. So you actually have very, very saline water, higher than the 35 parts per thousand that is typical of the ocean. So you can easily have that in lagoons. And when that happens, you actually can end up with salty water that flows out of the lagoon. So usually salt water flows into estuaries, into tidal areas, but you can't have an inverse flow. When you have really, really salty water, it will sink to the bottom because it's super dense, and it will flow out along the bottom of the lagoon. And quite often, because these are pretty shallow, we have no thermocline, okay? Here's a great example of some lagoons that are very, very interesting. So this is Bahia Magdalena. There are lagoons all up and down this part of what's called Baja California, okay? And so this is California here. So LA would be right around here. San Diego would be right around here, and then this is Mexico. And this is the Sea of Cortez here, okay, and the Pacific Ocean out here. And all along the edge of this, we have many, many lagoons. And these lagoons are an important part of the ecology of these whales. So these are gray whales, and they spend the summers up in Alaska. So they migrate along the west coast of the United States to Alaska where they feed, but the moms like to come south, and they will come south to give birth to their calves in these very, very calm, shallow lagoons. And you can see that you can see the baleen here. It's a baleen whale, and there's a lot of whale watching there. There's a great industry there of these small boats that take people out to see these gray whales. And these gray whales seem to be really interested in these boats. They'll actually come up and people will scratch them, and it's kind of a cool thing I'd like to see someday. So the difference between a lagoon and an estuary, remember, is a lagoon does not have any freshwater input, but an estuary does. We talked about atolls. We talked about, let's see here. We talked about this guy right here, this atoll. Let me just talk briefly about how these are formed, okay? So we have a hot spot that is between the mantle and the crust. And we have this mantle plume that builds up until we have an island that rises above the surface of the ocean. And a great example of this would be Hawaii, for example, okay? And then the plate is moving in this direction over this hot spot. So eventually this island moves away from the hot spot and stops growing. Okay, so a couple of things can happen when this occurs. You can end up with, this is very, 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 very heavy. It's a lot of rock, right? So sometimes this will sink back down. And when that happens, you can end up with just a shallow area like this, okay? It's called a guyot, right? So this is a sinking island here. This is the volcanic island, how it starts. This would be like a lot of Hawaii. And then other parts of Hawaii, you have sinking islands, and we have this guyot is one of them. But in some of these, you'll actually, as it starts to sink, it will grow these barrier reefs, okay? So this is very heavy here. These reefs will grow up, and this is so heavy it sinks, but the reefs are not nearly as heavy, and they will stay. So what we end up with is a circular reef, like this, around a sunken part of that, island, okay? And then you'll end up with this atoll. And then sometimes they'll just sink straight down, and then we have what's called a seamount. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at how these form.
Across the world, from Australia to the shores of Belize, coral reefs come in different shapes and sizes. One type of reef, most often found in the Pacific Ocean, tells a fascinating story about evolution and geologic time. It's called an atoll. When we say time, we mean big time. It can take up to 30 million years to create an atoll. Here's how it happens. An atoll begins with an underwater volcano called a seamount. As it erupts, it spills lava, which hardens as it meets the water. Over time, and many eruptions, the seamount grows until it rises above the water. Now, it's officially an island. As the centuries tick by, the volcano goes dormant. Underwater, the hardened lava becomes a home for all sorts of creatures, including corals. As the corals grow, they form a fringing reef around the island. Fringing reefs grow directly from a shore. They're the most common type of reefs. Over time, the reef continues to evolve. The island, this dormant volcano, can start sinking, weighed down by the heavy reef and rock. As the island sinks, the corals remain, growing upwards. Eventually, a wide band of water called a lagoon forms between the reef and the land. The fringing reef has become a barrier reef. Millennia keep spinning by. The extinct volcano is now completely submerged, but the corals are still growing. As they break the surface of the water, they die, and their stony skeletons turn into sand and rubble mixed with coral and algae. Now, a coral rim surrounds a central lagoon. The reef has changed yet again into an atoll. When there are gaps in the coral rim, the surrounding ocean flows in and out of the lagoon. New reefs can form inside the lagoon, called patch reefs. In the warm, shallow lagoon waters of atolls, coral reefs flourish. And so do the many kinds of animals who make them their home.